Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's forum between the Republican Tom Garrett and Democrat James Dittmar in their run for the 5th District seat in the U.S. Congress. My name is Deborah Hord, and I'm honored to be your moderator. The League of Women Voters of Charlottesville-Albemarle, along with the Greene County Republicans and Democrats, are delighted to have this opportunity to work together and bring these candidates to you, their constituents, once more. As you know, Virginia's 5th district is the largest congressional district, more true to me tonight than it has ever been. It is the size of the state of New Jersey or the state of Vermont, depending on what you like. It extends from Fauquier County in the north to the city of Danville in the south. This year, our two new candidates are running to be our representatives in Congress. They represent both the Republican and the Democratic parties. Before I introduce our candidates formally, allow me to cover some of the ground rules for this evening. The first 8 questions that we will have were solicited from the League of Women Voter members. After we have asked and those questions have been answered, there will be a small pause, and we will begin with the questions that come from this audience. Can I have the 2 gentlemen wave their arms who are collecting? Ed, Lois, do they just walk?
Oh, right there.
They're collecting things in the hall. They will be right here collecting your cards. If something comes up during the debate, you are welcome to come down and find them and give your card to them. Is there anyone here who needs a card or a pencil before we begin? Everybody's been covered. Good. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about applause. I know candidates and debates are exciting. I'm going to ask you tonight to hold your applause for the end of the debate. Our time is limited and we want to cover as many of your questions as we possibly can. We know that not everyone has made up their mind, and this is an opportunity for everyone to listen carefully and get the information they need to make a decision. I recommend sitting on your hands. I will not stop anybody for putting their hands together in prayer or supplication, but I ask that you hold your applause to the end of the forum. Each candidate will begin with an opening statement. They have already flipped a coin. The person who begins with the opening statement will be the person who ends with their closing statement. The opening statement is 2 minutes long, the closing statement 3 minutes long. In between, each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond directly to the questions asked. Our timers are in the front row. A yellow card notifies the candidates that they have 30 seconds. The red card that their time is up. In this debate, we will not be leaving time for we will not be setting aside time for rebuttals. We understand that in any political campaign, there are disagreements. We also like to hold to the truth that the national race for president is not our guide for behavior in the 5th District of Virginia. We ask the candidates to use tonight to offer clear responses to your voter questions and add valuable details to their positions. Following these guidelines, there should be no need for rebuttals. Should the need arise, the candidates may use any portion of their response time or closing statements for that purpose. With the towing costs, I'm going to introduce the candidates because I'm sure you're not aware of who they are yet. At the table with the blue tablecloth, Jane Dittmar is the immediate past chair of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors and former representative of the Scottsville District on the Board of Supervisors. She served as the president of the Charlottesville Regional Chamber of Commerce from 1992 to 2000. Ms. Dittmar is a Supreme Court of Virginia certified mediator for both the General District and Circuit Courts, and is a principal in the Positive Solutions Group. Tom Garrett, red tablecloth, lives in Buckingham County and is beginning his second term as state senator, representing the 22nd District. Prior to his terms in the state Senate, Mr. Garrett served as the Commonwealth's attorney in Louisa. He earned both his bachelor's and law degrees from the University of Richmond and began his service to our country with 6 years in the Army. Based on the coin toss, Mr. Garrett will open.
Thank you. Y'all just give me a minute while I figure this microphone out. Thank you, Deborah, and thanks to the League of Women Voters, thanks to Monroe High School for putting this on. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be a major party nominee for a seat that was first held by James Madison, the father of our Constitution. When you think about that, that'll keep you awake at night. I'm Tom Garrett. I'm asking you for your vote on November the 8th. Grew up in Louisa County, went to Louisa County High School, have nothing but fond memories of playing William Monroe in football, honestly. Went to the University of Richmond, as Deborah said, and paid for that with an ROTC scholarship. Neither of my parents worked for a president or a congressman. And I'll tell you that no matter what happens in this race, one of the greatest honors I'll have ever had in my life is the privilege of leading American soldiers on foreign soil in defense of our nation, what we stand for. Got out of the Army, crossed over to the dark side, and became a lawyer. You're allowed to laugh. And then became a prosecutor and was able to help people that way. I'll tell you a quick story. Went from a family, there was a murder right before I was elected. The family came in after I was sworn in and said, "We don't trust you to do the job. We're going to hire a prosecutor." I said, "That's not how it works." And I said, "I promise to do the best I can and get the best result I can." They were so shaken by our opponent's rhetoric during the campaign that they didn't believe that we could do our job. About 6 months later, after getting the maximum possible sentence for the man who murdered their daughter, they sent me flowers, and I received a Christmas card from them every single year that I was in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office after that. That's what public service is. That's what I've done in the Senate, where I've been recognized for education reform in K-12, been recognized as a regulatory reformer of the year, been recognized as a champion of free enterprise by the Chamber of Commerce, and now been endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. These are the voices of businesses and job creators, big and small. The NFIB represents 1,500 members in the 5th District alone. They've already made their choice. I ask you to join them in voting for myself, voting for jobs on November the 8th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this debate. We've had several in the Central Virginia area, the Charlottesville region, but I really wanted to participate in this one because of the League's reputation for nonpartisanship and running excellent debates. I want to tell you a little bit more about my background. The introduction was fantastic, and I thank the moderator. I grew up in Virginia, K through 12 in Northern Virginia, came to the University of Virginia to take an economics degree. I did graduate work at Darden Business School. I have graduate certificates from Virginia Tech in economic development and in public administration. I have a 35-year track record for creating jobs, first in my own successful businesses, and then, as was already explained, I served as president of our Regional Chamber of Commerce for nearly a decade. During those years, I worked with many businesses, small and large, and my signature was bringing the nonprofit, public sector, and private sector together to work in one direction to help our economy and other important projects succeed. I also was a founder of the Regional Economic Development Partnership, which Greene County is a member of, and we have celebrated our 20th year this year. I also am a mother, and my husband and I together have raised 6 children. I also, for the last 16 years, as was stated, I'm a certified professional mediator, bringing people out of the corners of conflict, helping them find solutions and moving forward. I intend to use that skill as well as others in representing you in Washington. I look forward to the compare and contrast tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, the first 8 questions come from members of the League of Women Voters. Mr. Garrett, the first question begins with you. What specific cuts to the federal budget would you be willing to make to significantly reduce the federal deficit, roughly $600 billion by some estimates, in fiscal year 2016?
I think that my opponent and I could agree that it's like Groundhog Day. I think we get these questions again and again and again. Last night I think we named 6 areas. I'm trying to scramble to remember what all 6 were, but I'll tell you this. We need to understand that Jefferson was correct when he said that government closest to home governs best, governs most efficiently, is most accountable. And the reason is that we're sending money to Washington that's being wasted, and it's piling not just onto that deficit, but onto a $20 trillion debt. That's $20,000 billion, and we're saddling that on our children and grandchildren. So what we'd like to do with the federal budget is do what we've done with the state budget, and that's go through and all these little colored marks, dozens and dozens, annotate areas that aren't actually the legitimate purview of the federal government. Send that money back down to the states, and quite frankly, preferably to the localities, to let them make decisions on how to spend that money. I was speaking with a mayor in a Southside town recently who showed us their $600,000 in federal grants for crosswalks, even though in his words he hadn't seen a kid walk to school for 10 years. And for a farmer's market, and he said, Tom, we got 70-year-old sewer and water, and we don't have the 500 households to pay to fix it. And Flint, Michigan tells us this is a true story. With specificity, however, we would be an advocate for defense procurement reform, for the reconsideration of funds spent on NPR and the National Endowment for the Arts. I think it's incredible when somebody receives a grant for $50,000 or $250,000 and then urinates in the jar and puts a crucifix in the jar. That's tax dollars wasted and beyond the purview of the federal government.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar, do you want me to repeat the question?
What cuts would I advocate
from the federal budget
on our budget
to begin to cut the deficit?
What I have been saying, and this is what I believe, is that when you have a budget that's in trouble, when you have a $19 trillion debt, and as you said, an unbalanced budget by more than $600 billion, you need to do zero-based budgeting. You need to take everything off the table and rebuild the budget from scratch. So I'm not advocating cutting everything, but I'm advocating doing that as the first step. Then what you need to do is, with members and colleagues on the Hill, is decide what the core services of government are that you wish to fund, and that's where the negotiation begins. And that's where you have to have cooperation and vision and articulation. So I think that one of the things that I wouldn't be able to do tonight is say that I would like to cut the National Endowment of the Arts. And the reason why is because that might be something I would like to fund, but then really in the process of finding out how much military spending, how much education spending, how much transportation spending, how much infrastructure spending we were going to do, we'd have to see if I could build that back in with permission of my colleagues. I know that you may be looking for more specifics than that, but I think that the zero-based budgeting process, which is laborious, it's hard work, and it takes a real focus on a legislative body to do, is where we're going to need to go as a country.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar, the second question goes to you first. Strong support for the Second Amendment and the tragedy of violence and suicide caused by gun use are a constant thread in the current American conversation. What measures, if any, would you support to reduce gun violence?
So by the way, I invite anyone who's interested in my positions on anything we don't cover tonight to go to my website. After really thoroughly thinking about the Second Amendment and protecting the integrity of it, I realized what I needed to do was to look at solutions for gun violence that were acceptable to most Americans and get that legislation passed. vast majority of Americans, and actually about 70% of NRA members now, support universal background checks. And I am fully in favor of that. It is not unknown to me how important guns and guns culture are in this district for hunting and recreation, for personal safety. And so it's not an attempt to prevent any type of purchase for someone who will use it safely and for good purpose. But I think the time has come to at least follow what we're doing here in Virginia and getting a full close on universal background checks. My opponent said the other night that there are universal background checks, but we have 300 million guns now in the United States that I think if they're going to be sold need to have universal background checks. I also like the no fly, no buy. We need to fix the list so that there is a easy, expedited appeal process if someone ends up there that shouldn't be. But if you're not safe enough to fly on a plane, you're not safe enough to buy a gun.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure, repeat the question. There's a reason I want you to.
Strong support for the Second Amendment and the tragedy of violence and suicide caused by gun use are a constant thread in our current American conversation. What measures, if any, would you support to reduce gun violence?
So the first thing I want to do is point out that the question is fallacious on its face because homicides and suicides aren't caused by gun use. They're caused by people. That's like saying that home construction is caused by hammer use. Secondly, I would point out in the previous question that my opponent said, quote, I'm not going to advocate cutting everything, and then didn't advocate cutting anything. Now back to the question at hand. First of all, no fly, no buy has been condemned by the ACLU as one of the most racist policies ever put forward in the United States. And I join with the ACLU in suggesting that a no-fly list that says that if your name is Muhammad al-Baghdadi, you may not purchase a firearm, absolutely positive. The civilized world in murders, and people like to attack modern sporting rifles as culprits. However, I would point out that if you combine blunt objects, hands, feet, and knives, you're over 10 times more likely to be killed by these items. Over 10 times more likely. These are the FBI universal crime statistics. I would also point out what Gandhi said. Man cannot be made good by law. If you take out the top 10 cities, New York, Chicago, LA, Atlanta, Miami, Boston, Denver, Dallas, Memphis, Houston, our murder rate gets closer to that of the rest of the civilized world. Here's the problem. Young people don't have an equality of opportunity. They need better school choices.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, the third question goes to you. Illegal immigration has been declining since the year 2000, and yet there are approximately 11 million undocumented individuals residing in the United States. Do you believe existing laws can address illegal immigration in this country? And what steps would you take to deal with the 11 million illegal immigrants already here, many for over a decade?
So I just read a story today that indicated that illegal immigration was up 23% in the last year. And the 11 million statistic is a good round number, but the data that I have indicates that there's somewhere between 9 and 22 million people here illegally. And I think that the fact that there's such an amazing delta between those estimates is indicative of just the breadth of the problem. Ultimately, we're able to track agricultural products. We're able to track every side of beef that comes in this country from Brazil or from Canada to combat mad cow disease, and yet our politicians throw up their hands and say, well, we can't keep track of people. Ultimately, that's an abdication of responsibility. The responsibility primary and foremost of the United States government is to look out for the people of the United States. And so what we need to do is control our borders. We need to find people who are here illegally. We need to say, okay, queue up. And I'm not saying hunt them down. They'll find themselves in the system. I can tell you that as a prosecutor. And get in line. And then we need to conduct immigration in this nation just like a professional sports team conducts its draft, based on the needs of the team. It should have nothing to do with the color of their skin, the nation you're from, the religion you worship, unless you're coming from an area where there's an active, ongoing radical Islamist conflict, and then we should wait until the FBI director says we can actually vet people, because he says we can't. And then we should conduct immigration based on the needs of the team. It's common sense, and there's so many other problems, candidly, that the laws and the books are ignored by Washington, and that's what we're going to change. I did that with the sodomy ban repeal in Virginia, and I'll do that with this.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
So immigration reform. Actually, politicians didn't throw up their hands and say, what are we going to do about this? The United States Senate passed in 2013 a comprehensive immigration reform bill that worked on and had policy for borders, for people who are here who are undocumented, for employers and workers who needed to have certain types of visas, for children that were born here that are citizens whose parents are not documented, for children that were brought here and they're undocumented but have lived here most of their childhood. It covered all of these things. It passed a bipartisan, Republican-controlled Senate, and then it was sent to the House of Representatives, where it died because the mainstream Republicans could not get it on the floor for a vote. The reason why they couldn't is because we have a group of Republican congressmen that are obstructionists. They're called the Freedom Caucus. Dave Bratt is one of them. I suspect my opponent would like to join him when he goes to Congress if you don't send me. And that is why we have had executive orders from President Obama and nothing done for the last few years. What we need to do is send people to Washington who are willing to work together, roll up their sleeves, make the hard choices, and put forth policy and legislation to address our challenges.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar, question number 4. Over 95% of the world's climate change scientists have concluded from their research that carbon emissions, as a result of human activity, cause the increase in violent weather, rising seas, and threats to our planet's ecological systems. Countries from around the world are meeting to reach an agreement on how to solve this growing problem. How will you support efforts to reduce carbon emissions?
Absolutely. One of the areas that I'm most interested in is clean and renewable energy, moving us as gracefully but as fast as possible away from dependence on fossil fuel. Can't happen overnight, but if we don't start and have good policy and good energy behind that, we're never going to get there. I also believe that climate change is a real and present danger for our planet and for our country. It has been identified as one of the top security threats by the Department of Defense. And I think that if we don't get moving on this, we are going to face catastrophic problems. NASA reported today that this is the hottest year on record, and that we've had the last several years of the hottest record heat that we are experiencing. It's causing extreme weather. And I think that if we don't work on this, mitigate the damage and work towards better, fewer carbon emissions, we are bound to leave a planet that is like a going out of business sale to our children and our grandchildren. And we can prevent that if we work together. That takes people going to Washington that believe in climate change, believe in solutions for climate change, and are willing to work on good policy to mitigate what has happened already.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So I want to hit the last question real quickly and move on to that. A bill dies in the House of Representatives because 60 people wanted it to. There are 435 members in the House of Representatives. Half of 435 is 217 and a half. The magic number in the House of Representatives to keep a bill from getting to the floor is 218. Does anybody see anything wrong with the logic in saying 60 people kept the bill from passing when it was broadly bipartisan supported? Now on to climate change. I'd absolutely be willing to consider supporting legislation that was actually fair to the United States. Do you know that in the last 3 years in the United States, we've averaged closing plus or minus 40 coal power plants a year? We've had a president and a candidate for a major party who said they're going to destroy the coal industry, and yet I'm fortunate enough to live in a spot where I can oversee the railroad tracks that run east from the coal mines in Buchanan County. And those train cars continue to go by full, almost always headed east with coal. And they come back empty to Buchanan County where the economy is dying because of oppressive policies. Folks, The climate change agreements that the current administration has entered into are a redistributionist scheme. They are opening more coal-powered power plants in China every single year than we can close. And they're not opening so they can close them next year. And so we all breathe the same air, and those carbon emissions, if they're bad here, they're bad there. Why are our leaders thinking first about what they can do for people across the Pacific before they consider what they're doing to people across the Potomac? If you want to convince me that we need to address this, it should be addressed in a manner that treats nations equally, not that sends our wealth to China.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, you'll get the next question. What is the federal government's role in providing equitable, quality public education for all children, pre-K through grade 12?
I mean, literally, Deborah, it's like it is Groundhog Day. I think we had almost verbatim the same question last night, and I love it. So what the federal government needs to do as it relates to Virginia and our K-12 ed is get out of the way. Federal education schemes have hurt more students and their abilities to learn in Virginia than they have helped, and I'll tell you why. Because contrary to what people will tell you, governors, Democrat and Republican, in the General Assembly over the last 20 years have done a job wherein we have in the top 5 or 6 schools out of 50 states of the nation every single year. And so any federal program that would seek to make all federal education standards uniform across the states could only bring Virginia in one direction, and that's towards number 25, which is average. We're the 12th largest income tax paying state in the nation. They take our money and then they dangle carrots in front of us and tell us how we have to behave, and if we do, they'll give it back. But candidly, anything that brings Virginia closer to the average of the 50 states brings Virginia down. And we've said this before, and I'll say it again, Jefferson understood. We know the needs of Greene County students in Greene County. We understand the needs of Albemarle County students in Albemarle. What we need to do is recognize that in a very few instances, our children aren't failing the schools are failing our children, and we need to create school choice and opportunity for people in low-income areas to vote with their feet so that their children will not grow up in a world that they know because of their zip code they don't have the same chance as everyone else, because if there's a single fundamental entitlement of America, it's equality of opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
So the question is, what role should the federal government play in education?
In providing it, yes.
So there are a couple of wonderful roles for the federal government, and she's former Secretary Ann Holton, Secretary of Education, and I talked a lot about the fact that our Department of Education, our federal Department of Education, can study worldwide trends, can look at emerging economies, can look at best practices throughout the world, and can bring that by being a convener to our states and to our best school systems. What can they do for failing school systems? The money that my opponent suggested should come back to the states is coming back to the states, and it's coming back through the state to our local boards of education. Local boards of education are in charge of policy, and they are funded by property tax. So your poor counties don't have enough money to pay their teachers, and they don't have enough money to resource their classrooms, and so it is by zip code that way. So we're working on national and international models, and we're also identifying school systems that are failing. I think so, just to summarize, I think that looking at national education policy so that our next generation is competitive and meets the needs of tomorrow's economy is something that can be done on a national level, working with our states and local education leaders. I think funds coming through for specific types of education, for disability, education for Down syndrome, for autism, that can come through the federal government. So there's quite a role that the federal government can play through the Department of Education.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar, next question. To what extent should the U.S. involve itself in foreign conflicts? In particular, how should the U.S. handle the complex situation in the Middle East, namely Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran?
Well, I think through the course of our history, we have involved ourselves in foreign conflicts. I think the number one litmus test is for national security. We do provide world stability with installations all over the globe, and we need to continue that. We need to continue our partnerships with NATO and other alliances. These are the things that keep most of the rest of the world safe and stable. The Middle East is very difficult. The Middle East is conflict upon conflict layered, where allies change depending on the country. Syria is particularly problematic. We have another superpower, Russia, who is supporting Assad, who is there, who has created one of the biggest humanitarian disasters of our lifetime. But no-fly zones have not worked, negotiations have not worked, and I do not have a solution for Syria tonight to offer you, except to say that there is a role for our American military to play outside of our borders.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So on the last question, my opponent said that we would look at what they're doing educationally in emerging nations, and my comment would be it is a sad day when the United States looks to learn what it should do educationally from emerging nations. And I'll tell you that it used to be that emerging nations looked to us. Now, we lost an amazing opportunity in Iran when the people of Iran stood up to overthrow the Ayatollahs and the radical regime there, and we sat by silently. The lead from behind doctrine of this administration has failed, and when they say lead from behind, they only mean that as it relates to not intermeddling in nations wherein we overthrow governments that are stable and replace them with chaos. There was an article in the Agency France Press yesterday where they interviewed Libyans who said they longed for the old days, the good old days of Muammar Gaddafi. We overthrew a regime that was compliant, and weapons funneled from that regime into Turkey and south into Syria, where we looked to overthrow another stable regime. Our hasty exit from Iraq without achieving a status of forces agreement has led to the bloodshed of thousands and thousands of people. I would say this: where a nation presents a clear and present threat to the United States, we should act decisively. However, we should never, ever utilize American military power, ever, where we cannot articulate what the successful end state would look like, and that is precisely what we're doing in Syria right now. And we're playing this game against a nuclear state with Russia. There are no good options. We need to know where we're going before we get involved.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, the next question begins with you. What are your thoughts about the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour? Do you support an increase, and do you support indexing the level to the cost of living in the future?
You know, we get this question a lot too. I mean, probably 4 or 5 forums. Here's the reason that you don't want to increase the minimum wage, but you should consider, if you're going to indexing, that's a different animal altogether. And you ought to look at programs like reverse income tax. If you increase the minimum wage, you destroy any opportunity for young people to get jobs. And ultimately, when we treat the 16-year-old who's working so that they can earn money to buy PlayStation games the same way that we treat the 28-year-old single mother who's working to support a family, we make a ridiculous mistake. Again and again during this race, we've heard the story of people who were on public assistance, only to come off of public assistance, only to go back onto public assistance when they learn that they had more money and benefits on it. So the system is fundamentally broken. What we should do is encourage and incentivize work by, when people are going back to work, creating a reverse income tax that would augment their salary to a position where they could support their family if they were a wage winner, but not destroy opportunities for our young people to learn a work ethic if they're a recreational worker, if you will. I lifeguarded, I've literally dug ditches, I've washed dishes, I've worked construction, I've cut grass. All these things made me a better, harder working person, and I fear that our young people lose these opportunities. You don't raise the minimum wage for everybody. You raise the minimum wage by virtue of a reverse income tax or some augmentation of the social safety net to help breadwinners, but you keep jobs available for young people because that builds character and a work ethic, and we need that in this nation now more than ever.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
So when I was 16, my father, I'm born in April, my father said, okay, you need to have a job by the summer. And so off I went to find a job, and I worked for minimum wage. I had no trouble finding a job for the minimum wage. The question was, would we support a minimum wage increase? And I would. Right now, the current minimum wage does not provide a livable wage for people. What we have to do, I think, is tie it to a cost of living index like we do some of our other programs, so that we don't have to fight about this all the time. During the primaries, Bernie Sanders and others were talking about a $15 minimum wage. I think you can't do a nationwide minimum wage. The example I like to use is a minimum wage in Manhattan is not going to be enough for $15 probably, and they probably aren't paying $15 an hour in Manhattan. A $15 an hour in Bristol, Virginia is way too much. So we need to have a floor that the federal government sets, tie it to cost of living increases, and then let trade areas or states determine if they would like to set a higher minimum wage.
Thank you. The next question begins with Ms. Dittmar. In 2014, a Commonwealth Fund report ranked the U.S. healthcare system last among other developed countries for highest cost, lowest coverage, and poorest outcomes. What will you, or should our nation do, over the long term to ensure quality, affordable healthcare?
We need to do something. We need to have people go to Washington who are willing to work on something. Right now, the people in Washington that represent us are either trying to tear up the entire Affordable Care Act or trying to enshrine it. All of our energy is going in to preserve something that needs to be fixed. The benefits from our current Affordable Care Act are tremendous, and we want to figure out a way to keep the benefits and fix some of the problems. That takes creativity, it takes energy, it takes negotiation, it takes people who are willing to do this kind of work. We want to keep 20 million new people that have been insured. We want women to not have to pay more for their health insurance. We want people to be able to take their insurance with them when they leave an employer. We want people not to be denied health insurance for pre-existing conditions. We want there not to be a cap on insurance if you have a catastrophic illness. These are all really positive things, but there are some negative things, and we haven't done a darn thing to work on them. So my specific ideas would be to look at the ways in which we decided to pay for the Affordable Care Act. There are a couple excise taxes that are not good ideas, and they keep being pushed back because they are unpopular and probably won't work. We have to look at this Medicaid expansion issue. We are one of 19 states that haven't expanded Medicaid. So when we reduce in 2018, if that goes through Medicaid payments, we're going to be in big trouble in the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett.
So I often joke that if you want to figure out what a bill does, just take what they call it and then take the exact opposite and you'll understand it. The Affordable Care Act isn't. And it's interesting that a president who said that $7 trillion in federal debt was unpatriotic, only then to rack up what I guess in the history major's parlance be unpatriotic times 3, would tell us that healthcare was unaffordable and then implement a system that the Democrat leaders said we had to pass to find out what was in it. But what we've learned is that the Affordable Care Act has seen premiums go up 2- and 3-fold and deductibles go up 3- and 4-fold. In fact, it's estimated in Pinellas County, Arizona next year, as one example, there'll be no remaining plans. In fact, there'll be no health care plans that serve that county. Right now, it's estimated that 1 in 50 people has no plans to choose from. Next year, it's estimated that number could go as high as 1 in 6. And so, before we talk about what to do, let's talk about what not to do. The ACA is that. Now, if we look at health savings accounts that were introduced just over a decade ago, and you take a $1,400 premium for a family of 4 multiplied by 12, you're looking at about $16,000 a year, plus a current deductible stratus that's getting us into an area of about $6,000, $7,000 for a deductible. You're at $21,000 a year for a family of 4 just in healthcare, folks. You got your HSA. It's done. Now, let me say this. We should maintain portability. We should allow people to compete across state lines. We should allow the coverage for no pre-existing conditions, etc. But the Affordable Care Act needs to go.
Thank you. Based on the quick talking of our candidates and your magnificent behavior in not interrupting, we have caught up with our original. So we have a small halftime break where I can confer with the people who have the questions from you. I want to thank you both very much for answering the League's questions. It's a perfect time to stretch. I'm going to try to keep it to 3 minutes, and then we'll be back at it with your questions. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you very much for your questions. The two gentlemen here in the front row would be happy to take a couple more questions if anybody is inspired. Also, in welcoming our candidates back, why don't we have a nice round of applause before we can't do it again. Mr. Garrett, you begin this one because Ms. Dittmar had the last one. Our first question from the audience. How will you defend Congress's power in the face of executive overreach, regardless of the party in power?
Honest to Pete, I swear we're getting it's like Groundhog Day for the third time. So we've talked a lot on this campaign, and I think that my opponent has, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think she said she supports the same idea about H.R. 4768, the Separation of Powers Restoration Act. What we've come to is a circumstance where there are $1.6 trillion, $1.9 trillion in regulatory burden on our businesses in this country. The job creators in this country are paying what amounts to $6,000 for every man, woman, and child in this nation before they unlock the doors and turn on the lights, before they produce the first widget or render the first good or service. So the regulatory climate is destroying jobs, and I can make a good argument that the regulatory climate is why Lane Furniture and Burlington left out to Vista and Gretna, and why the 5th District has been beaten down so hard. That plus trade deals that look to other nations before they look to the United States. And what the Separation of Powers Restoration Act does is recognizes that Article 1 of the Constitution says that the legislative branch makes laws. What's happened in this country is, under the Chevron Doctrine of 1984 and a federal court ruling, executive regulatory agencies like the EPA, which one person once dubbed the Employment Prevention Agency, may promulgate any regulation that is legitimately intended to further a law passed by Congress. What this means is that Congress passes a good bill like the Chesapeake Bay Act, and then ultimately the EPA says that the mud puddle in your driveway is navigable water and you have to pay for runoff mitigation, okay? The lawmaking branch is the Congress. We need to return that power to the Congress by passing good bills like the SOPRA, and that was an almost exclusively Republican championed bill when it passed this year.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
I'll answer that by starting out with a quick story. When I was chair of the Board of Supervisors, my colleagues and I met with our state legislators, and we pointed out to them that they had passed so many new regulations that we had an 80% spike in overtime in one of our departments, just trying to keep up with the new regulation. And our state legislators, both Democrats and Republicans, looked at each other and shook their head, and they were like, well, we didn't do that. Well, you know what? They passed one law. It went over to the executive branch to write the regulations, and they all came piling down on the county of Albemarle, the county of Greene, all of our local governments. That's really parallel what's happening in Washington. And the answer to that is to send people to Washington who will do the hard work to pass very crisp legislation that talks specifically about aspirational goals and implementation so that power loves a vacuum. The executive branch doesn't come on in to do the legislators' jobs. Now, in a perfect world, you have legislators that are working and doing their jobs, the executive branch is doing its job, the judiciary is over there doing its job. If any of the three overreach, there's checks and balances in this beautiful Constitution that we passed. So normally what you would do if there was executive overreach is you would appeal to the judiciary. Your legislature would appeal to the judiciary to solve the problem. But we have a dysfunctional Congress, we know that. We need new people there.
Thank you. The next question is on defense spending. Ms. Dittmar. We have begun to cut defense spending while still sending forces overseas. How can we fund the services in a way that will allow them to modernize and continue to compensate the troops?
That's a really good question. I like the way it was asked. When I began this journey this year, there were certain areas that I wanted to get expert roundtables together, and we are blessed in this district with superior retired military and actually active military people. So we put some roundtables together, and one of the questions we posed at each roundtable was, let's talk about military spending. Is it enough? Is it about right? What should we be doing? And the resounding answer, unanimous at roundtables, was that if Congress would quit telling the military how to spend their money, there's plenty there to do what they need to do. Now, these are focus groups with military represented different branches at different levels, and so it's not completely authoritative, but we explored that, and as it turns out, we're using military spending to create jobs, which is an economic development function. By that I mean, as example, the F-35 is a very costly fighter, well overrun in terms of budget, billions, and it's being produced in 50 states because of the US Congress. So if we would allow our military to present their budget, say this is what we need, and we can use this money to do it, I'm not sure we would need to change the level of funding unless we had national security issues that needed to be funded on an emergency basis.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So I spent 6 years at an expert roundtable on military issues and spending called the United States Army. And I can remember when we were scheduled to go to the field to train or do live fire exercises, when we were pulled out because there was no allocation for money for fuel or for ammunition. And I can remember understanding that we needed to have our pacing items, those are the items that you absolutely positively must have operational at all times to go to war and not be able to get parts. And my colleague to my left, your right, is absolutely correct. The F-35 has been a massive boondoggle from the beginning, not only because they decided that they would build a fighter jet based on what congressional districts might produce what parts, but also because it's woefully inadequate for the task at hand, but I digress. Fundamentally, we need to understand the role of government at each level. I love Virginia, but she does not need an aircraft carrier. If you, like I, as a legislator, will ask yourself this question before voting in favor of any expenditure or any bill, you'll oftentimes find that at the end of the day, there's a whole lot more money left over than you thought you'd have. And that question is as follows. Is this expenditure constitutionally and foundationally an appropriate expenditure for government, and here are the key words, at this level? At this level. And so when we begin to roll back some of the spending on items that we've discussed earlier, then we'll find more revenue for things like national defense that are legitimate federal expenditures. But in the meantime, procurement reform and listen to the soldiers.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, this next question is on taxes. Do you think taxes should be raised or lowered at the federal level?
Well, they need to be altered. I mean, there are a million different plans out there that make more sense than what we have. And candidly, the real problem is that you've got a political class who lacks the courage to do what's right for fear of being unelected. I can't believe we're this far into the forum without somebody saying, well, you voted against funding for every good program you can imagine, and then not pointing out that we also voted against funding for a lazy river at the VCU Student Center, an ice cream machine at the State Supreme Court, and tents in our state parks. But you need courage to stand up and say no, and you need to be willing to stand up and say no in the face of powerful interests, even perhaps when they've supported you, when there are a million tax attorneys and a million accountants who have a vested interest in keeping our tax system convoluted. You can be assured that it will cost too much, it will cost to administer, and it will take more than it needs, so long as your representative's not willing to vote against the budget, so long as your representative's not willing to say, no, that's not an appropriate expenditure at this level. So yes, there absolutely, positively needs to be tax reform. I candidly suspect, and I think Kennedy's policy and Reagan's policy showed us, that we can grow the economy and increase revenue generation whilst cutting taxes. Again, John F. Kennedy started that, one of the reasons I greatly admire him. Reagan only stole it from him. But at the end of the day, we'll never get spending under control until you have politicians who are willing to take the barbs from their future opponents because they were willing to stand up and simply say, no, that's not an appropriate expenditure at this level.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
I do not think we can piecemeal fix the tax code. I honestly believe it is so complicated. It's tens of thousands, well, I think it's 78,000 pages. There's no tax attorney or CPA in the entire country that understands the entire tax code. I think we have to do what we need to do with budgeting, and I'm telling you, it is a lot of work to do zero-based budgeting, but I think we need to take all of our taxes at policy, the incentives, the deductions, the specific types of taxes in each industry and each activity off the table. I think we then need to build it back. I think there could be general consensus around the child deduction, around charitable deductions, and around mortgage interest rate deduction. And beyond that, we have to sit down. It could probably take 2 years with the right kinds of people at the table working on each section to come back with a proposal on a much simpler tax code. And I do agree with my opponent that there is a lot of money to be found in reorganizing the tax code. There are taxes in there that don't make any sense anymore, and there are incentives in there that don't make any sense anymore. If we were to do that work with the right people in Washington, we could have a simple tax code, and I think that's the way to approach what we need to do to change it.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar, this next question is again on the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment. Hillary Clinton is on record as saying the Supreme Court got District of Columbia versus Heller wrong. Do you agree or disagree? Why or why not?
The current Supreme Court has gotten rid of restrictions that certain cities have implemented that the Supreme Court feels has hurt the Second Amendment. One is in DC, one is in Chicago, there may be others. So what we have to do is look at whether we want local jurisdictions, especially all those cities that Tom was talking about having such great difficulty with gun violence, if we're to allow them to enact their own no guns like DC used to have, or a great restriction on how many guns you can have, those sorts of things. And I do think the Supreme Court is the one to decide that. Now, when they decided on Heller and when they decided on Chicago, I personally disagreed with that. I will not be in the court to actually make those judgments. I do know that, for instance, Indiana, which is within eyeshot of Chicago, because of their lax gun laws, end up supplying an awful lot of the guns that are used in gun violence in Chicago. So I think the broader question is, should localities, cities, states, be able to enact gun legislation and restrictions? We do that in Virginia, so I think that probably I would be in favor of that, although I won't be on the court to make those decisions.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
I don't want to be rude, but I didn't hear any answer in that question, in that answer at all. So Ms. Clinton's on record as saying that Heller Court got the decision wrong. Mrs. Clinton is wrong. The Heller case hinged on whether or not the right to keep and bear arms was an individual right belonging to an individual. And if you view the Constitution from the frame of what was going on in the nation at the time that it was drafted in the Bill of Rights, then you'll understand that that was indeed the intent of the founders. And it blows my mind that 4 of 9 justices can't view that document simply drafted through that prism, but they couldn't. And so I'll actually answer the question and say Mrs. Clinton was wrong. Now, having said that, it strikes me as the exception that proves the rule when Chicago and Washington, D.C. have murder rates that far, far, far outstrip the nation, and liberal politicians continually blame states like Virginia and Indiana. Folks, what you learn from the fact that Virginia recognizes our Second Amendment right, that Indiana recognizes people's Second Amendment rights, but that Chicago and D.C. don't, what you learn is that when guns are outlawed, outlaws still get guns. The people who don't have guns, those who abide by the law, and they are no threat to anyone. So I will say yet again, Mrs. Clinton was wrong, and that's why she's wrong for America.
Thank you. We get back now to some questions on schools and education. The first one is, where do you stand with regard to Common Core? A straightforward Virginia question. And will you fight to keep control of our schools in the hands of localities? Both of you touched on this briefly, but the audience would like a few more details. Mr. Garrett, you can begin.
So, Winston Churchill once said of democracy that it was the worst system in the world except for all the others. And I find a great deal of humor and intelligence in his comment. We have in Virginia the SOLs, and praise goodness for the SOLs, because while they're completely busted, they've taken us out from underneath the umbrella of Common Core. Having said that, the reality is that the textbook market is driven almost exclusively by the two largest states, Texas and California. Therefore, we still have Common Core seeping into our classrooms. I spoke about this earlier. Virginia, generally speaking, with the exception of impoverished areas with socioeconomic opportunity lacking, has amazingly good public schools. Common Core seeks to make every state's public schools equal, and folks, when you sit in the top 5, the top 6 in the nation, and there are 50 states, Common Core can do nothing but bring us down. I have been a warrior for K-12 ed reform. I worked to roll back the number of SOL tests as a patron of the bill. I worked to eliminate the ridiculous and draconian 140 seat hour requirement. You should train until you understand the material, and if that takes 70 hours and not 140, then so be it. And if it takes 150 and not 140, then so be it. But we don't train to time, we train to standard. Learn that in the Army. And I worked to eliminate the barbaric practice of seclusion and restraint across party lines with Senator Barbara Favola in Virginia. I will continue to lead as it is appropriate at the federal level.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
Virginia was a state that actually participated in the development of Common Core, but Common Core you can opt out of, and I believe we opted out of it. There are educators that I respect that feel that in states that have excellent public education and consistent throughout their jurisdictions and municipalities, the Common Core isn't needed, and that would be a good reason to opt out. So I think that when I look at our 5th district, we have some jurisdictions that have very low property rates. They are not able to educate their children. It concerns me that those Virginians are going to be able to have good livelihoods and support their families when they graduate. So I'd like to look at something that ensures a certain minimum level of quality in the students coming out of schools, which means that we then would support the school system at a higher rate. Now, I do have to bring this up. I know my opponent's been waiting for this. My opponent voted against a budget, and he voted against it as the only Republican to vote against the balanced budget this year. He voted against pre-K, K through 12, workforce training, community colleges and universities. I understand his desire to privatize in that. I've heard that before. But what we need to do is give authority to our local school systems to set good policy, but look at their ability, our county's ability to be able to pay teachers and create a good education system for all of our children.
Thank you. The next question, and we're at Ms. Dittmar. Explain what American sovereignty means to you. Why is it important? How will you defend it?
That's a great question. I think that American sovereignty is an important concept, that it brings us together as a union. It allows us to feel as one country. It allows us to make decisions internationally that are good for our country. We do live in a world that has to relate to one another, and so I think it's in having good diplomacy and good understanding from legislators making trade policy about when and where we must be cooperative and when and where American sovereignty means that we isolate or protect what is ours. I think philosophically, it depends on what we're talking about. For instance, when we are looking at trade, we may get a question on trade. I can elaborate more at that time.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So the last question, it was said that I voted against the balanced budget this year. Anybody that reads the papers knows that we have a $1.3 billion shortfall in Commonwealth Virginia. That the governor, who could not be giddy enough to celebrate the first state biennial budget that exceeded $100 billion, I mean, he celebrated that, now has to take $400 million from our rainy day fund that could have gone to support education, our troopers, our deputies, public health, public safety. And so maybe if they'd listened to some of the frugal people who said, you're spending money on things that are not within the legitimate purview of the state, we wouldn't have this problem. Now, what does American sovereignty mean to me? American sovereignty is the right of the United States to self-determination. As an individual in this country and in the world, you have a natural law right to define success for yourself. That's which makes you happy. In the Jeffersonian construct, anything that you do that doesn't affect another, you should be allowed to do. And as a nation, we have a right to that self-determination. American sovereignty means to me the right to lead and not to follow, the right to lead from the front and not from behind, the right to zig when other nations zag, because when we have historically, folks, we've been right. And finally, American sovereignty means to me that the laws and circumstances of our nation will be determined by Americans and not by international law nor the United Nations. America is the greatest nation with all its warts and pimples ever to face the planet, and will continue that way so long as we retain that sovereignty.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, this next question goes to you. There seems to be a trend to pass legislation which is vague and leave the agencies to define what they think the law means. They give the example of the Affordable Care Act. Is this a trend you wish to curtail or encourage?
I got a feeling there's going to be a lot of agreement on this question. It's so incredible to me to contemplate that 20,000 pages of legislation could somehow remain vague. Think about that. But it was. We had to pass the bill to find out what was in it. When the first year I was in the Senate, they said, now's the time when you vote to suspend the rules. And all the freshmen said, okay, we vote to suspend the rules. And then we said, what rule did we suspend? And they said, oh, that's the rule that says that we have 2 days to review the budget. But if we take those 2 days, we might run over. And I said, you want me to vote for a document? This is about 1/5 of it. This is a supplemental budget that's 5 inches high without giving me so much as 2 days to review it? And they said, yeah, we always vote to waive the rules. And myself and a group of other freshmen said never again on our watch, and they haven't done it since. So if that's anecdotal as to whether or not we should pass more vague legislation, I can assure you I will be a warrior against it. I have never voted for a bill in Virginia that I have not read. I will concede I voted against some that I haven't read. But yeah, that's the problem. We have abdicated the authority in the legislative branch to the executive regulatory branch, and they are killing jobs, and they are destroying the sole birthright of Americanism, which is the promise of equality of opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
I think that this is probably a companion question to the one we had before, and I do believe that the legislative branch cannot abdicate its responsibility in considering legislation, working through the details of legislation, passing legislation, and this is really important. After it's implemented, going back and revisiting it to make sure that it's working the way it was intended. We're never going to get anything perfect the first time. We can get maybe close to it, maybe not. But by revisiting, that's how we make it even better. I would like to point out to my opponent that all the other Republicans in the state Senate voted for a balanced budget, except for my opponent. And I don't know if he's trying to say that all those other Republicans weren't doing their job or what. But we have a rainy day fund when receipts end up in a particular year not matching up. It gets filled up certain years, it gets depleted certain years. So I don't want to take away from my point that you are the only person that would not work with the rest of your Republican colleagues to get the balanced budget passed this year.
Thank you. This next question begins with Jane Dittmar. Americans are hearing consistently that there's a possibility that this upcoming election is rigged. The question is, do you agree with the idea that the election is rigged? I'd like to add, do you have any thoughts on how we can make sure that Americans feel their election results can be trusted?
I think that it's very dangerous rhetoric to suggest that American, especially our national elections, are rigged. Are they completely fair? Have they ever been? Will they ever be? They're part of human institution. Our electoral boards and our electoral machines are being worked on at the local level to make sure that they ensure one man, one vote. I think that it's wonderful that Trump's Vice President Pence has reassured Americans that he will accept and that the other Republicans will accept the national results. That while we may want to say it's rigged, maybe that plays well as a soundbite, we can't undermine Americans' view about our elections November 8th.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So my opponent said she doesn't know what I'm trying to say, so I'd like to articulate on that for a moment. Because it's neat having served in the Virginia Senate. It's a building designed by Thomas Jefferson, so to sit in it, much less serve in it, is pretty special. Everybody knows, and everybody in the building, the General Assembly knows, that if you vote against the budget, you'll be punished with less cherry committee assignments. I could make a good argument that I should have been chairing the Education Health Committee last year. Everybody talks about that. Everybody knows that if you vote against the budget, you'll never join that third political party, because make no mistake, in Richmond, there are three political parties: Democrats, Republicans, and then the men and women on finance and appropriations. They're the real powerful party. You'll never get in that party. Everybody knows if you vote against the budget that you'll be subject to political attacks by your opponent, who cherry picks items from the budget to say, hey, they voted against this, but they don't tell you you voted against the lazy river at the VCU Student Activity Center. And everybody knows if you vote against the budget, it gets a whole lot harder to get campaign contributions, because if you vote against the budget, you vote against everything that's in the budget. But folks, I did it. That's what I'm trying to say. You asked me, what am I trying to say? That's what I'm trying to say. And you know what? I did it because the next year, the line item that had the money for the tents that could have gone to our teachers, if we'd have taken the tent money out and paid our teachers what they should have been paid, 3,000 more Virginia teachers could have gotten a $500 a year pay raise, and nobody was making that fight but me. And the next year, the money was off that line item. We won that fight. And I'm going to tell you what, we are descended from people who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to do what was right. And I'm going to continue to do what's right, even in the face of political consequence, because that's what we have to do to save this great nation.
The next question is about the presidential candidates. I'm going to give you two parts. The first is to help us understand your support of your party's presidential candidate. And I'd also like you to add how you would conduct yourself should your party's candidate not win. It begins with Mr. Garrett.
Is it rigged or not? That's your question?
That was her question.
I thought, did you ask it?
No, the audience did.
I thought it was you. Okay, I want to answer that. No, it's not rigged. But people do cheat. And it's funny, I mean, you can laugh about it if you want. I don't think it's funny, because every single vote should be worth exactly 1.00000 votes. And I want to tell you a secret. As a prosecutor, I actually successfully prosecuted people for voter fraud. They've also done it in Brunswick County, Chesterfield County, New Kent County. It's been done all over Virginia. You know, and they registered 19 dead people to vote in the Democrat office in Harrisonburg. Right? 19 dead people who all happen to be over the age of 65, which is the age with which you do not need a photo ID to request an absentee ballot. Coincidence, you ask yourself. I don't know. I didn't register. So it's not rigged, and there's certainly not enough votes that will be stolen to change the outcome of this election. But people do cheat, and that should be intolerable. Now, the next question is, why do we support our party's candidate? Put simply, the Supreme Court of the United States absolutely, positively matters. I would hate to say this to Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump, but in the next 8 years, what happens on that court is far, far, far more important than what either presidential candidate will do. At stake is the individual right to keep and bear arms, the hallowed court, right? Ms. Clinton said they were wrong. At stake is the Establishment Clause of the Constitution that says Congress shall make no law establishing a religion nor prohibiting the free practice thereof, which means you can't tell my daughter to take a Bible to school, but you can't tell her she can't. You can't tell my daughter she has to pray in school, but you can't tell her she can't. That's at stake. At stake is search and seizure. At stake is your right to be secure in your papers, your person, and your property. And so that's what this is all about, and that's why I support my candidate.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Ms. Dittmar, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I heard it. So why do I support my party's nominee? And what will I do if Trump wins? Okay. All right, so I support Hillary Clinton for president, and I'm going to bring it on home to the 5th District as why. We've had some wonderful questions about international issues, national issues, but the role of a congresswoman is to pay attention to the 5th District. We only have 2-year terms. That keeps us closest to the people. We have to bring home results and do the things that matter to you. I do not want to be distracted by an unsteady hand at the helm. I believe that Hillary Clinton has the experience and the knowledge and a steady hand, more steady than the alternative. I'm quite worried that if the alternative wins, that I will be distracted as your congresswoman, worrying about international disasters and national disasters and people not getting along and tweeting in the middle of the night. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to tweeters, but I mean, think about the reality TV show that we've been in the last year. So I want to focus on the 5th District, and I need somebody who's paying attention to other things and not creating disasters worldwide. And I fear that about Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is sent to the White House by the people of the United States, I will work with my new president.
Thank you. Another question from our audience has to do with job creation in the 5th District. Do you have a plan for job creation for the 5th District? Ms. Dittmar, you begin this one.
So I mentioned that this is actually an expertise of mine. I wrote the economic development plan that launched our regional partnership, and what we did was we respected each jurisdiction's desires as far as targeted industries. We looked at each jurisdiction's assets, the things that would attract employers, the things that help local business grow. And we looked at some of the deficits. What sorts of things need to be done for that jurisdiction to build its business base? And that's part of the science of what we put together in this region. For the entire 5th District, except for the city of Charlottesville, the urban suburban area of Albemarle and Danville, we have a digital deficit that is hurting and holding back our economies. We need to invest in high-speed internet infrastructure and reliable cell service, or our local businesses cannot grow organically. We cannot attract new business, which hurts us with job creation and therefore also tax revenue for the jurisdictions. Our plans will be coordinated, if you use that seat in Washington, with our regional economic development partnerships, our local offices of economic development, and our state resources and professionals to create, convene, and to help each jurisdiction the way they wish to be helped, and to help each region with its natural assets and to solve its natural deficits.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett?
So in that last question, it was, what will I do if Hillary wins? And I'll tell you, it's ironic that I was in the governor's mansion with Terry McAuliffe, with my then fiance, on the night that the Schutz Brewery visited Richmond. And if you, I won't show you my text messages, but there's a running back and forth between myself and the governor. So I guess if Hillary wins, he's already told us that he's going to make sure we get to the White House for dinner with the president. At which point, I suppose I'll take whatever influence I have to try to get her to understand the Constitution and the importance of appointing justices to the Supreme Court who do. But contrary to rhetoric, we get along quite well with people on the other side of the aisle, even when they're wrong. We also talked about disasters worldwide, and it made me wonder, because I think she said that would be the case with Trump. Disasters worldwide, like a million Christians being displaced in Iraq, disasters worldwide, like people being beheaded on the beach after we overthrow a stable regime, disasters worldwide, like Benghazi, like 13 destroyed electronic communication devices, like 30,000 plus destroyed emails, like quid pro quo with the FBI says they're reclassifying information. Having said that, Jobs, we'd fight TVP, we'd champion the I-73 corridor, we'd champion an expansion of the 29 bypass that was advocated by our opponent. We would reduce regulation, we'd fight on behalf of SOPRA and RAINS to return the legislative power to the Article 1 recipient of that power, the Congress of the United States, and take it away from the regulatory branches. And we would look to restructure corporate taxes to understand that we don't exist in a vacuum, we compete in a globe.
Mr. Garrett, this last question will begin with you. Currently, the U.S. Congress has one of its lowest ratings in terms of trust and popularity among the American public. Can you let us know why you're actually running for this position and how you think you can change that feeling?
Well, I'll tell you, I started out as a soldier and we were held in amazingly high regard by the public, and then I went to law school. But I became a prosecutor, which was held in slightly lower regard, and then I became a lawyer, which was even lower regard. So I figured if I ran for Congress, that was the only way to continue the nosedive. No, look, I mean, 1 in 26 people are lucky enough to be born here. And we have been bequeathed a birthright by amazing people who were far better, and I don't mean this to offend you because I'm going to include myself in this, than anybody in this room. Dr. King, President Lincoln, 580,000 Americans who died to free other people during the Second World War, even more who died during the Civil War, 2 wars of independence, an underground railroad, a 16-year-old named Barbara Johns who led a student protest in Prince Edward County to say there's no such thing as separate but equal. By gosh, we are so darn lucky just to have the right to be here. And we need to take the time to be grateful for it. So my 14-year-old said, Daddy, how can you do a job where you know certain people will hate you? And I said, baby, it depends on who hates you, right? Because at the end of the day, we will either make it better or we will destroy it. And so I'm going to do this job to give with every single fiber of my being something worth the deaths of my friends overseas. I'm going to do this job to give with every fiber of my being the same birthright to equality of opportunity that I inherited to my children. That's why I'm running for this office.
Thank you. Ms. Dittmar?
So in business, we call it, how do we improve the brand? In terms of the legislature, why are people so either furious, angry, disgusted, disappointed? Why is there so low of approval rating for the United States Congress, and in our case, the House of Representatives? It's because we're not doing the people's business. We're not addressing the challenges of this country. We're not doing the work that we are supposed to do in holding those seats. And so each district, if they elect the right person, will show the people that live in that district what that seat is being used for, staying closest to the people, delivering the services that they're supposed to through good constituent service, being home in the district when you're supposed to be, and making sure that the votes that you make are representative of the values of the district. Also, good, hard committee work that delivers results for the district, I think, would help a great deal. But it's going to take a team effort. It's going to take people throughout the country sending people to Washington to change it. Be the change that you want Washington to be.
Thank you very much. Those were the last of the questions from the audience. The League of Women Voters gave me 2 final questions, one for each of the candidates. You'll notice right away that they do go back to some of the topics that have been discussed tonight. And I believe this is simply an opportunity for our candidates to go deeper and not feel they need to repeat themselves in any way. Mr. Garrett, we'll begin with you.
Well, did I not answer the first question first? The last question first?
You answered the last question first. Indeed, you did. Thank you. Ms. Dittmar.
Yes.
Your background in business was one of the centerpieces of your campaign. We have the following question. With general unemployment hovering at 5.5%, increasing to 8.7% among women and 10% among African Americans, what will you do and what will you bring from your background that can help to increase job opportunities for Virginians and more widely U.S. citizens should you be elected to the Congress?
So I do have to tell you how focused I get on my own district. I've had gatherings up in the northern part of our district where people from Winchester and other counties that are not in the 5th district have come and said, well, could you do that for my area? And if it's national policy or working with the state government, it will help them. But I told them, I said, make sure that your congressman or woman and I get together, because they will have to do in your district what I'm going to do for ours. Now, in this region, for the Charlottesville trade area, we're enjoying a nice lower unemployment rate. We have an underemployment rate problem. In the south side, we need to do some work on roads. We need to do some work on attracting new employers. We have to figure out how to connect, and I have a Jane's for Jobs on my website, connect the 3 important areas that help create nurture jobs. The first is making sure you have excellent workforce training. And we have some wonderful providers. We just have to make sure the jobs are waiting at the end, or that the training matches the jobs. The second thing we need to do, and I can't stress this enough, is we must make sure we deploy high-speed internet and self-service into each of our areas. You can't look for a job, you can't find a job, you can't get a certification to improve your employment if you don't have high-speed internet at home. So we'll work on that. And then finally, I'll team up with our partners and help attract new businesses, appropriate businesses to jurisdictions.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, the question that is for you has to do with healthcare and Medicaid expansion. So your record is very clear in terms of Virginia General Assembly and your refusal to vote for Medicaid expansion. Please let us know of your specific objections, and what will you propose that will help states increase affordable health care coverage to their citizens?
Right, so we need to go back and look at free markets. We need to allow competition across state lines. There is no such thing remotely resembling a free market in healthcare, and there hasn't been in my lifetime. And Ronald Reagan said that the Aiden was frightening worse in the English language where I'm from the government and I'm here to help. President Obama promised us an Affordable Care Act, and it literally raised real health care prices threefold over the course of a few years. Right? And as it relates specifically to Medicaid expansion, I had the privilege of serving on the Medicaid Fraud Prosecution Unit as a member of the Virginia Attorney General's office. I don't know if people knew that or not, but it did. And it might blow your mind to know that when the biennial budget of Virginia, that is how much we spend to run the state for 2 whole years, was about $90 billion. And oh, by the way, the national debt is $19,000 billion, but the biennial budget was $90 billion. We recovered in fraud and waste from Medicaid alone in 1 year over $1 billion. And so that means that it's half the biennial budget. That means it's about 2% of the entire state budget recovered in fraud and waste in 1 year in Medicaid. And so to suggest that the way to close the coverage gap is to double down on a program where the money to fund it came from Virginia to begin with, because we're the 12th largest contributor of federal income taxes, is like throwing people off the Titanic and onto the Lusitania. We know Medicaid is broken. It is broken so badly that if we don't fix it, we'll continue to hemorrhage money, and doubling down on a broken system is not the way to fix another broken one.
Thank you. It is currently time for each candidate to make their closing statement, and then we'll wrap up with some applause and a thank you. The closing statements begin with Ms. Dittmar. But you made the first.
No, she gets to go last. We always fight over who gets to go last.
Yeah.
She usually wins, and she won again tonight. So it's
All right.
me.
All right.
It's 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
It is 3 minutes for your closing statement.
I might end this one early. You know, I want to reiterate thanking the League of Women Voters. Deborah, you've done an amazing job. We stalked you on the internet. We were afraid that you were going to be unfair. You've been amazingly professional. I personally offer you a heartfelt thanks.
Thank you.
William Monroe High School, the 2 unit chairs, you know, and I think Jane will echo this. Just sitting up here in front of you guys saying, here's why I want to serve you, is humbling as heck. It really, really is. This is a district where Jefferson lived, Madison first served, and Patrick Henry retired. This is a district that contains Prince Edward County, where the real Brown versus Board of Education case started when a 16-year-old girl stood up and said, I will not tolerate the lie that is separate but equal. We have so much to be proud of, and to even have the shot at representing this district is mind-numbing. You know who I am now. If you don't, then you're not paying very close attention. I'm a pretty simple guy. I tell people all the time I aspire to be the most predictable person in the legislature. We shouldn't spend more than we can afford. We should remember that the founders were brilliant in their vision and try to stay as close as we can to the foundational principles laid out in our Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and subsequent amendments. And we should understand that American sovereignty is not something that is ever to be negotiated. We are the greatest nation on the planet for a reason, and we shouldn't be following emerging economies. They should be following us. In 1930-something, in the height of the Great Depression, American humorist and observer Will Rogers said the whole world's itching for just a little bit of what we got. And even in the worst economic times in American history, he was right. And so if you believe, like it says on my opponent's website, that illegal immigrants have a right to be Americans, that's a quote, there's a choice. If you believe that you don't have a right to be an American, but you might earn the privilege to be an American, there's a choice. If you believe that a strong national defense and projecting force to confront our enemies abroad when they present legitimate threats to the United States, but doing so with a clear and definable end strategy, is the appropriate attack on radical Islam and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, there's a choice. If you believe we can defeat these enemies with a PR campaign, there's also a choice. If you believe that Obamacare has created some great outcomes that we should seek to continue, as it says on my opponent's website, there's a choice. If you believe that the Affordable Care Act has cost more Americans and cost more opportunity and eliminated more jobs and destroyed more opportunity, there's also a choice. The Chamber of Commerce has awarded me Champion of Regulatory Reform, Legislator of the Year, and Champion of Free Enterprise, and the National Federation of Independent Businesses has endorsed me. They've already spoken. I'm asking you to join them in speaking with your vote for me on November the 8th. God bless you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Ms. Dittmar?
So I have a question for you. Who would you rather send to Washington? Someone with a proven track record of job creation experience, someone who brought infrastructure back to her county for investments in roads, dams, firing ranges, training centers for our police, someone who opened a development that will serve to pump $9 million new dollars of tax revenue into the county's coffers. That's the Wegman new area, 5th Street Station. Someone who has a strong mediation, conflict resolution background, used to negotiating not only business deals, but bringing people together, organizations, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. Or would you prefer to send someone who, in his work in the General Assembly, on his own campaign literature, boasts that he never compromised with moderates, that he was the only senator to vote no on a balanced budget? And I reject the notion that all of those Republicans who voted with all the Democrats to pass that budget did so to sell their souls for committee assignments or campaign contributions. They did it because we have to have a budget to function as a state. We also have to have a budget to function as a federal government. We don't want to send someone to Washington, I hope you don't either, who will shut down our government, who will not do the hard work to balance the budget there, who will not work to address the challenges of this country. So tonight, my mother is with me. I'm very proud of her. She was a leader not only for the National but State League of Women Voters here in the state of Virginia. She taught me a lot about civic responsibility and duty. My husband is generous to our community and has been well before I knew him. My dad has passed. He brought us to Virginia when he went to work for the Kennedy administration. That was a time when people believed in government. That was a time when people went to Washington to serve the people. That was a time when people went there because they believed that America could address any challenge it was faced with. That is a primary reason why I am running. I want you to imagine a Washington that begins to work, a Washington that does work, a Washington filled with people who want to work for you and get the job done. And I want you to imagine your first Congresswoman. I ask for your vote November 8th. Thank you very much.
This brings this campaign forum to a conclusion. I want to thank you both very much for running for your positions, for doing so much for our 5th district, and I wish you luck in the election. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being so much a part of our democracy. I thank the Greene County Democrats and Republicans and the League of Women Voters. Don't forget to vote on November 8th.